Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today we are checking out the fastest monitor we have ever reviewed, ASRock's PGA27FFX2A, thanks to its 520Hz 1080p IPS panel. Squarely targeted at competitive gamers, it also supports adaptive sync, up to 400 nits of peak brightness, and it offers a claimed 1 millisecond response time. But is a 27-inch screen size just too big for the Full HD resolution? And does 520Hz even offer any benefit over cheaper 240 or 360Hz monitors? We're going to find out in today's video. Clearly then, ASRock's PG27FFX2A, despite the mouthful of a name, is all about the 520Hz refresh rate, eclipsing other 360Hz monitors we have reviewed in the past. It's not actually as expensive as you might think though, as we found it priced for around £380 on Neo computers, though it is more like £460 over at Scan. Let's dive in and find out if it's worth the cash. Starting first with the design of the monitor then, if you've seen our reviews of the ASRock PG27FFX2A or the PG032UFS, you will know what to expect. That's because the core design is identical between those three screens, being mostly matte black plastic with a fairly large and bulky stand. I have to say I personally don't find it to be overly appealing. It may not be hideous, but nor is it a particularly refined aesthetic. I'd also prefer to see a more compact square foot instead of the V-shaped foot, which measures approximately 45cm across. The stand does offer a decent array of ergonomic adjustments though, including up to 100mm of height adjust. There's also 20 degrees of swivel both left and right, and then tilt from -5 to +20 degrees. That does mean that there's no pivot functionality, which ordinarily I would find a shame, but you also have to factor in how many people are really buying a 520Hz monitor to run it vertically. Third-party VESA 100x100 mounts are also supported. ASRock is also persisting with its built-in Wi-Fi antenna feature that we've now seen a couple of times. I guess it might be a value add for some people, but it's just not something I'd personally use. As for I/O, video inputs are fine with two HDMI 2.1 and one DisplayPort 1.4. The only other ports though are a USB upstream and then two Type A downstreams along with a headphone jack, so that means no USB or KVM functionality, which I would hope to see at a monitor of this price. I also would have expected to see an OSD joystick, but instead we find 5 fiddly buttons used to adjust the monitor settings. ASRock has at least spaced the power button out from the rest, so it's harder to accidentally turn off the screen when you're in the OSD menu, but I really do think a monitor that costs about £400 really needs a joystick in 2025. As for the OSD itself though, everything here is split over 6 main tabs, and I have to say, not only does it look very dated, but it's lacking a number of features I'd expect to see from a modern gaming screen. There's no sRGB emulation mode for instance, nor are there standard gaming oriented features like an on-screen crosshair, different presets for different game genres, or a sniper style view mode either. It does offer options for adaptive sync and then 3 overdrive modes, but that's about it, so definitely work to be done here. Hopefully those default settings can deliver the goods, as there's really nowhere else to go.
Looking to buy a gaming PC? Then you need to visit CyberPower PC. We'll help you with the best spec at a price you'll love. With us, you get 5 years warranty, a lifetime of technical support, and systems built by experts. So it's no wonder so many gamers choose CyberPower PC.
That leads us nicely on to our testing then, where we use Portrait Display's CalMan Ultimate software paired with X-Rite's i1 Display Pro Plus colorimeter. We'll kick things off with our brightness and contrast testing, where we see the overall range of brightness from the PG27FFX2A is solid. It could go a bit dimmer, bottoming out at 72 nits, but it peaks at 463 nits, which is well above ASRock's claimed 400 nit figure. Contrast is also impressive for an IPS panel, sitting at around 1460:1, well above the claimed 1000:1 ratio. The monitor also has a reasonably wide gamut too, generally exceeding the sRGB space and then delivering 91.5% coverage for DCI-P3, 94.2% Adobe RGB, and 69.7% reporting for Rec 2020. It may not be reaching quantum dot levels, but for a 520Hz monitor, it's definitely wider than I was expecting. Default grayscale performance is solid too. Gamma tracking is very accurate out of the box, closely hugging the 2.2 target and averaging 2.188 over the 20 shades tested. Color balance is also fine, averaging 6330K, though you can see there is a slight green tint visible. I personally didn't find it overly distracting in real world use, but it does enough to push the average grayscale Delta E 2000 up to 3.14. The good news is that the PG27FFX2A does support manual color balance, and by leaving the red channel at 100 but dropping green to 98 and blue to 97, I was able to achieve stellar results with a new average color balance of 6542K, improving the grayscale Delta E 2000 to just 0.51 on average, which is a phenomenally good result. As for our saturation sweeps, results are typical of an IPS panel, given we see a fair chunk of oversaturation relative to sRGB, though this improves slightly when compared against the DCI P3 space. The same also goes for colour accuracy too. Relative to sRGB, we're looking at an average Delta E 2000 of 3.71, and that improves to 2.26 for the DCI P3 space. As mentioned previously though, and unlike almost every other modern monitor on the market, this screen does not include an sRGB emulation mode. That means if you want to get more accurate results, we have to manually calibrate, and in fairness to ASRock, the IPS panel used is clearly very capable, delivering excellent results across the board once we did calibrate, with the only slight aberration being the 100% blue channel, which isn't quite covered by the screen's native gamut. However, I do really wonder how many people buying a 520Hz gaming monitor are actually going to calibrate it or even have the tools to calibrate it, so I really do think ASRock missed a big trick by not including an sRGB mode. Other areas to touch on also include viewing angles, which are okay, but really not as good as I'd expect from an IPS panel, which is perhaps a compromise from its sheer speed. We can also see just a small amount of backlight bleed, but again, nothing out of the ordinary for an LCD. Time to move on to our response times though, where we're using the open source response time tool. We're going to start off at 520Hz, where we use all three of the overdrive settings within the OSD. So starting at 520Hz with overdrive turned off, the results really aren't bad at all. The average response time hits 4.95 milliseconds, and while there is some overshoot on a handful of transitions, it's really nothing noticeable. Enabling the normal overdrive though does give better results, improving the average response time to 4.05 milliseconds at the cost of increased overshoot, but even then the average error is under 12 RGB values. We do also have the enhanced mode, though this does kick up overshoot even further while only improving response times to 3.78 milliseconds, so I would say that the normal mode is your best bet. It's also worth touching on refresh rate compliance, however, given a number of transitions don't fall within the 1.92 millisecond window for 520Hz compliance, meaning, as we'll see shortly, some extra blur will be introduced. The good news though is that the normal overdrive mode also works across the refresh rate range. We tried it down at 120Hz as well as at 360Hz, and it delivered similar results to what we saw at 520Hz, so adaptive sync gamers won't need to keep changing overdrive modes depending on the game. To put those results into context then, if we remove OLED monitors from our chart, we can see this is actually the third fastest LCD we have ever tested. You could probably get better speed from a 520Hz TN panel, but that would be at the expense of overall image quality. Taking a look at those results in practice then, thanks to the Blurbusters UFO test, there may not be a huge improvement in motion clarity at 520Hz compared to 360Hz, but I do think there is a small benefit to the higher refresh rate. Compared to 120Hz though, you can clearly see a massive difference. We can also see the three different overdrive modes here tested at 520Hz. There's honestly not much difference between them, but enhanced does introduce more visible overshoot compared to normal, and I wouldn't say it offers any benefit for motion clarity, so the normal mode is my recommendation. Now, the previous fastest LCD monitor I ever tested was the MSI NXG253R, which is a 360Hz IPS panel that released all the way back in 2021, so it's not a surprise to see the PG27FFX2A does deliver superior results. Both motion clarity and ghosting are improved. That said, without any form of backlight strobing, high refresh rate OLED technology will be superior, even against a 520Hz IPS panel. The motion clarity from an OLED at 480Hz, for instance, really is insane, and even at 360Hz, I'd say it looks a good chunk better than this ASRock monitor, though you obviously have to factor in the higher cost of OLED too. One other benefit to such a high refresh rate as well is that input lag is very low indeed at just 1.25 milliseconds, so that's a little over half a frame at 520Hz, which is certainly not something I'm going to notice in practice.
If you're looking for a new chair, then definitely go and check out boolies.co.uk. They offer a whole host of gaming and office chairs that come in a variety of different finishes and different colours.
Time to talk about the actual real-world gaming experience then, and clearly this monitor is all about maximising the motion clarity for games that can hit 520Hz. That probably rules out most of your traditional AAA titles, but things like CS2, Rocket League and other competitive games are much easier to drive at higher frame rates, so you really will get the best from the screen in those scenarios. Now, please do excuse my awful Counter-Strike skills, but there's no denying the overall smoothness of the image in games that can be driven at 520 FPS. I even tried dropping the refresh rate back down to 240Hz, and I definitely noticed the difference. I think if you come straight to a 520Hz display, I'm not sure you'd notice immediately, but it's when you go back that you really realise what you are now missing. Even the smoothness of the cursor in Windows is just much more obvious at 520Hz. However, being completely honest, if you're not going to play games at least close to the max refresh rate, I think this probably isn't the monitor for you. I tried a few other slower paced style games, but really found myself noticing the relatively low pixel density. After all, it is 1080p across 27 inches, so we're only talking about 82 pixels per inch, resulting in the image looking pretty soft overall. The screen does still benefit from the decently strong contrast for an IPS panel, plus the gamma is nice and wide, so you do get a saturated looking image, but I just really found myself noticing the lack of sharpness for slower paced titles. I don't think it's as bad for faster paced games, which this display is really aimed at, given obviously a lot more tends to be happening on screen a lot faster, but it is definitely something to keep in mind. Now, this monitor also supports adaptive sync, and while it isn't officially G-Sync certified, I had no issues with it on a 4090, there was no flickering or anything like that, so that is a plus. One thing I think would have been a good inclusion though is Nvidia's Reflex Analyzer to get accurate and real-time latency readouts, something that would perfectly suit a 520Hz display, but given the other features that are missing, it's perhaps not a surprise to see that ASRock hasn't included it either. Overall then, it has been a very interesting few days putting the ASRock PG27FFX2A through its paces. We've never actually tested an IPS monitor with such a high refresh rate before, and that is clearly this screen's USP, though there are plenty of other factors to consider. One is the factory calibration, which I really don't think is too bad. There's a slight greenish tint to the image, but this is easily fixed with a minor tweak to color balance, while gamma tracking is actually very good indeed. It's just a shame that there's no sRGB mode included, something I consider a real miss in 2025. On top of that, the monitor is otherwise very light on features. The OSD, for instance, looks very dated and doesn't offer many, if any, gaming-oriented settings, while there's also no USB-C or KVM functionality. I am once more very frustrated to see 5 fiddly buttons used instead of an OSD joystick. Monitor manufacturers, please sort that out. As for the actual gaming experience though, we can't deny the impressive motion clarity on offer from the 520Hz refresh rate, marking a notable step up compared to older 360Hz IPS panels that we have tested for comparison. That said, the response times of the panel aren't quite able to keep up, so there is a little bit more blur than there would otherwise be if all the response times fell within the 1.92 millisecond window needed for 520Hz. You also have to factor in the screen size too, with 1080p looking fairly soft over the 27-inch diagonal. I appreciate there's really not many other IPS panels that push the refresh rate this high, so your options are a bit limited, but if it were me and I was looking for a super fast 1080p screen, a 24 or 25-inch panel would be my preference for the increased pixel density. The PG27FFX2A though does have at least one more trick up its sleeve, and that's pricing. Currently retailing for about £380 on Neo computers. As far as I can tell, this is easily the cheapest 500Hz plus IPS panel, with the next best option being this one from Alienware, which is more like 550 quid at the time of filming. Now, it is fair to say that this monitor clearly has room for improvement, and I also think it's fair to point out that it's targeting a pretty niche area of the market too. But if that is you and you are looking for an IPS panel with a refresh rate this high that also won't break the bank, in that case I do think, despite all of its flaws, the ASRock PG27FFX2A is worth buying. That is going to do it for this video though guys, so if you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Please do like and subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to ding that notification bell so you don't miss when we upload a new video. If you want to carry on the conversation as well, you can find a link to our Discord server down in the description, and while you're there you can also find links to both our merch store and our Patreon if you want to help us out that way. That's it for this one though guys, I'm Dominic the Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.